Now for one of my favorite discussions, because this is one of those contentious areas where you're going to hear a lot of advice from people that I'm going to tell you right now can be very bad advice. And you're going to see this scattered across many of the code standards you see online for JavaScript. And what I'm going to do right now is recommend that you ignore those standards, and I'm going to tell you why. Throughout the course, I've been using a style of declaring variables that you really probably haven't noticed is a style, but I've been using a style of declaring variables where I declare them very close to the point where I'm going to go about using them. So in the case of determining if the pile is empty, that we have no cards, right before my check of what I want to do in that case, I go ahead and declare the no cards variable and initialize its value to whatever the length of the cards array is to determine if there are no cards. Both the variable declaration and its first use are side by side, line by line here. This will make a little bit more sense in a minute. Let me explain the rest of this function. Down at the bottom of this function, getting the top card off the pile is declared and initialized, or the top card is pulled out of the pile as the first line. The next line declares this next rank variable and sets its value. And then the next line determines if the card is the next rank in the same suit. Again, declaring the variable and setting its value all on one line, and then using it right on the next line of code. Now, what do I mean by declaring variables as close as possible to where they're first used? Well, this top card and next rank, heck, everything at the end of this function, we could yank out and put up here at the top of the function. So we could have put all those checks at the very top. And then at the very end, we could go about determining whether or not we can drop the card. Take a minute, look at this though, and see what you think about this function. How easy is it to understand what's going on versus where we were at before? Go ahead and pause or back up the video if you need to. What I don't like about this style right here, and we're not even talking about what you're going to see in code standards online, but what I don't like about this style is we're computing all these things at the top of our function and then determining what we do at the bottom to return the appropriate value to callers. What we've lost in all of this is that these three variables here are only involved with the last part of this conditional. So by moving those to the top here, that's one more thing that people, when they read this function, have to keep in their mind. They have to figure out what all these variables are for, only then to understand what's going on in the following code. Versus the other style, where variables are declared very close to where they're used, I'll go back to that again, we now kind of have this differentiation, even have this blank line here to draw a paragraph, if you will, in our code. We know that these variables are all related to the final return statement, and we know that this if statement along with the no cards variable are related. What quite a few code style guides recommend is to declare all of your variables at the top of your functions. Now that's not quite what I was showing. I actually moved the declaration and initialization to the top. The initialization part is somewhat optional. Let's take a look at what moving just the declarations would look like, which is the recommendation of a lot of code style guides. So we have quite a few variables in this function. Let's move all the declarations of them to the top of the function. We'll start out with the no cards. So we already have the declaration here at the top. What we'll do is break a few lines and put the initialization on its own line. And then a lot of the code style guides will go a step further and recommend that you use a multi-variable declaration. Some of them will just put all the variables on the same line. Some of them will return lines. We'll start out with them on the same line. So top card is the next variable we use. Again, we'll get rid of the declaration here. Next rank, and card is next rank in suit. Let's copy those. Okay, so we have our variables all declared at the top of our function. Now most code style guides will also recommend that you go ahead and break a line to declare all these variables on their own line so it's easy to see all the variables involved. Why do they recommend this? Some of them claim it's actually about readability. But if you ask me, we just added 4 lines of code. And anytime you add lines of code, you have to be highly skeptical that you're actually doing something to improve the readability. The only real valid reason is that by moving your declarations to the top of the function, you won't use something before you declare it. But any modern linter can actually detect that problem for you so that you can quickly fix it. So for example, if before these variable declarations, for whatever reason I decided to use the noCards variable that I declare thereafter, you can see right away I'm getting a warning that I've done something I shouldn't be doing. ESLint is telling me I'm using a variable before it's even defined. So I can fix that at that point. And not only can linters help out, but as we'll see in the next section, if you have good test coverage in your application, you're not going to run into issues with declaring variables right next to their first use. I'm going to get rid of that. Another problem I have with this style of having the declarations at the top, so these last three variables only have to do with this last part of the code. Of course, we can make that obvious by leaving the initializations toward the bottom of the function. But that doesn't entirely reduce the overhead in interpreting that information as we're reading through this function. Because it's possible we could be using these variables inside of this block of code, and we have to very carefully, explicitly look at these or have an editor that helps point it out to realize that these have nothing to do with this chunk of code here. Likewise, noCards has nothing to do with this bottom chunk of code. If, however, we had the declarations at the bottom, that would be immediately obvious to us. Because if we were using those variables before the declarations, we'd be getting a warning. So we'd be getting some indication that we have a problem, or if there are no problems, we'd obviously know that everything's okay and those three variables are only a part of the end of the function. And also because of this, because these are declared at the top, if we want to do any of the refactorings we've been talking about in this course, where we start breaking apart methods, we now have to somehow figure out, okay, let's say, for example, we wanted to rip out this chunk of code into its own method. We now have to figure out what are the declarations involved with that chunk of code. We have to remove them. Oh, and look, we have an error because we have commas joining these sections together. Talk about that in a minute, but actually I'll leave that so we can talk about it in a minute. And then I have to bring those down here. Oh, and oh no, now I need to add a var and I have to put a semicolon. And then I've got to yank out this chunk of code now, and I can now move that code off somewhere else. A lot of steps involved to just do a very basic refactoring where I yank some code out to try and put it somewhere else. And that's the problem with this style. If you don't declare variables close to where you use them, you significantly reduce your ability to refactor your code. Let's put that back though. And I'll undo copying the declarations, put them back at the top. Okay, so we pointed out another problem too. We got that error when we tried to yank these out. We have to reconcile this first line and put a semicolon there and get rid of the semicolon and get rid of the commas. And we've got all these extra things to worry about, which points out another thing I don't like about this style. And I'm being very subjective at this point. You may like this style, but another thing I don't like about this style is at the top, if I'm doing a multivariable declaration, the termination of the declaration of each variable switches from commas to a semicolon, which makes it very hard to reorder that or pull declarations out. If you are going to declare things at the top, I personally would recommend, instead of a multivariable declaration, declare these all as single variable declarations. Why? Because now if I want to remove just these three that are a part of the bottom of this function, I can yank these out without having to think about the declaration of the noCards variable. Let me put those back. If for whatever reason it's so much of a burden to go the extra step and do single variable declarations instead of a multivariable declaration, I think that's the smell that's telling you that this style of putting declarations at the top of the function is not adding to your code and not adding to the understandability, but it's obviously adding a lot of complexity because you're trying to reduce the noise involved in the noise you're adding by getting rid of some var keywords and using commas instead of semicolons. If it's so painful to have these separate, I think that's a sign that this style is not helping you out. Because of all of these reasons, I firmly believe that you should declare variables very close to where you use them. It will significantly boost the readability of your code over a huge declaration block at the top of a function. Now with all of this said, I think the cases where having all the declarations at the top of a function is really a problem are a smell where we probably could be doing something to simplify that function as well. And then we don't have to argue over whether or not declarations are at the top of our function, because they'll tend to just be there if our functions are simpler and shorter. We'll tend to have all the variables we need right at the top. We'll turn to that next.